So then we start with session 1, and I'm really happy to introduce Arjen Boin to you, our first keynote speaker. So this first session is about Crisis Unbound and about the reinvigoration of the concept of crisis, given the fact that the crisis experience is expanding more and more. And traditionally, one might say that the crisis is the contrary to normal. Today, it seems that crisis has become the new normal. And what does this mean, the normalization of crisis, conceptually and practically? This is more or less the topic of this first session. And I couldn't imagine a better keynote speaker to introduce this topic to you as Arjen Boin. He has done very important contributions to this topic, especially on transboundary crisis and more recently on creeping crisis. Arjen is Professor of Public Institutions and Governance at Leiden University in the Department of Political Science. Previously, he worked at Utrecht University and Louisiana State University, where he also was director of the Stevenson Disaster Management Institute. He has written tons of high-end papers and also very important books. And I just read a few of them. So most recently, Governing COVID-19, a Crisis Management Perspective, published by Palgrave, or Understanding the Creeping Crisis, also published by Palgrave. Managing Hurricane Katrina by Louisiana State University Press. And I stop it here. There are many more titles to be cited, but yeah. And interestingly, Arjen Boin is also a managing partner of Crisis Plan, an international crisis management consultancy. So he does not only know the academic sides, but also the practical side of crisis management. And now I'm really curious to hear you talk, Arjen. Please, the floor is yours.
In any event, I was saying welcome. Thank you, Oliver. That's what I was saying, actually. Thank you, Oliver, and then welcome, colleagues. Great to see so many people on this, coming together on this important event, important for the project, and how timely, one could say, talking about what we call, sometimes we call that the crisis reform thesis, the idea that crisis gives rise to change, opportunities to change, and I think talk about opportunity structures, and then we have to then sort of consider how that relates to the whole idea of crisis, and we've been studying crisis for such a long time, and I'm sure everybody else has been doing that too, and how did COVID change our insights? I think that's also important to consider today. So my idea would be to talk a little bit about transboundary crisis, because coming into this COVID crisis, we were noting that the transboundary dimension of crisis was becoming more important, and especially in the sense that practitioners seem to be worrying about it a lot more. Then COVID happened, and at first, you could say, oh, look how transboundary all this is, coming all the way from China, all the way to Holland, and all these other countries, very transboundary. And but there were other dimensions that have become very relevant. And Oliver already mentioned one of them. This is sort of the time dimension. And so we also need to talk about the creeping or protracted nature of crisis. So we're going to try to do all this. I'm going to now try to manage this presentation, and that's working great. And what I propose to do in about 30 minutes or less, hopefully, so we have plenty of room for discussion, is to briefly talk about a few trends and how I see then the modern crisis, let's call it the modern crisis, and then outline some of the challenges that this type of crisis is posing, and then illustrating them with some of the governance challenges that most likely we've all observed during COVID. We've all become researchers by default just by going through this, and throwing up some potential solutions, after which we can then, of course, debate how realistic those solutions are. I mean, we can come up with all sorts of solutions, but we have to consider whether it's actually possible. So the trends that we've been noting, and I want to start with the creeping crisis, because what we're trying to denote here is the type of crisis that builds up over time, sometimes years, perhaps even decades, if you think about climate change, or years in terms of financial crisis, and months maybe in terms of pandemics. Or the whole idea is that that they're not flash events, but they have a history, a noticeable history, something you can observe. And then the question, of course, becomes why people or policymakers do not manage to come to a timely recognition of the importance of certain events. So the creeping crisis, I think, is, and let's just re-emphasize that point, may become one of the more challenging crises of the future. Now, tied into that, as I will argue today, is the legitimacy of institutions, public institutions. I think there's a relation between crisis management in all phases and the legitimacy of public institutions, the institutions that we expect to perform certain tasks before, during, and after crisis. And I think COVID has really brought that point home. Now, social media is, when you talk to practitioners, you really have to mention that, because practitioners have no idea what to do with social media, and they kind of farm that out to information specialists or communication experts. And but it is a trend, and especially with the disinformation campaigns that play out over social media, is something to consider. But I will be focusing today mostly on the transboundary dimension, and the argument being that in the threat environment of modern states, the transboundary crisis is just an ingrained feature. And I want to explain that a little bit, and then outline the particular challenges that come with this development. So before I do that, and this is I think the only definition that I will use, I'm using all these terms, so I think I should define them. So the mother of all definitions, the crisis definition, combines the three elements of threat, urgency, so the perception that something needs to happen now under conditions of deep uncertainty. And if you just look at the COVID crisis, then you can easily see that those three elements were present, and the one sort of variable during that crisis was urgency, which over time kind of disappeared and then came back. And I think that is also interesting. Those three variables can change during a crisis, and that's especially during a crisis that lasts for a longer time, a protracted crisis, a long shadow crisis, if you will. So you see the three differences, three different types that and of course there's a flash crisis, everybody understands that, but hopefully we have conceptual clarity here, at least for now, and then we can move on with the more interesting stuff. So transboundary crisis is fascinating me for years, basically because I've noticed that government arrangements, processes, rules, regulations, institutions are just ill-suited to deal with crises that stretch out over borders. And you just have to look at this little list of examples of types of crises that play out over borders, and then you'll recognize, say, well, these are really the big crises of our time. And it started. It started for me in 2010, and as we're all traveling academics here, the traveling circuits stopped by COVID. Then you'll remember 2010, May 2010, with the Icelandic ash burst, which affected many conferences and a lot of traveling. And I was amazed, I'm still living in Louisiana, that I couldn't make it to France for a very nice conference, because you simply couldn't reach France by air, because some Icelandic mountain or had produced ash, all over Europe that you couldn't even see. So I thought, that was and then of course we were in the middle of the financial crisis, and then you can see the overlap between the financial crisis and the ash crisis, and we moved on from there. So let's look at some of the characteristics that bind these various types of crises together. So obviously the first one is the boundaries, and it's not just national borders I'm talking about, but I'm also talking about different sectors, policy sectors, if you will. And I've been using this picture a long time because it really resonates with me. This is a picture where you see Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria some years ago, and this is a flash crisis there, causing a lot of damage. But it became a crisis in a totally different domain, because it turned out, there's few people that realized at the time, that there's a few factories on Puerto Rico that manufacture medicines that are used in cancer treatments all over the United States. So it caused a totally different type of crisis in the United States in a totally different sector. And I thought that was a really nice example of a transboundary crisis. But we only have to look at COVID, where it both has a geographical but also a sectoral dimension. It's not just a health crisis, but it's become an economic crisis, and then it became a social crisis, and then within those domains you've had many other types of crises. So the compounding effects are intriguing, to say the least. And the time perspective is interesting, because transboundary crises tend to develop over time, kind of having a creeping crisis nature to it, with incubation and sudden escalations, simply because they start out of one sector or one country and maneuver sort of into other systems. That can happen very fast in a technological system. This is an example of, and I'm sure everybody recognizes that picture, testifying to the symbolic nature of crisis as well. This is a picture that signifies the immigration crisis. In refugees fleeing to Europe and then causing a crisis all the way in Sweden and anything in between. So yet another example. The third characteristic, and this is really from a policymaking perspective. If you talk to policymakers, they are confronted suddenly with a manifestation of a crisis that has maybe look very differently in the original domain where it came from, and then presents them with a situation that they really have no idea how to deal with, and to them an incomprehensible event. It doesn't necessarily have to be for us analysts, but I think the financial crisis is an excellent example that, starting out in the U.S. as seeming mortgage crisis, and then became the crisis of the euro, a European crisis, literally one of European integration almost, or at least the north-south divide, just in a matter of months. And the logical sort of resultant of all this is, if you have different domains, different sectors, different countries, you're going to have different responsibilities. And that is very frustrating, as we will see. We'll get back to this characteristic. So it really challenges our government structures. And for many of these crises, they're incomprehensible. If they come as a surprise, and we're looking at that Icelandic ash out here, it almost is logical that solutions have to be made on the fly. So we're talking about improvisation a lot, and that is true for many sorts of crises, not just transboundary crisis. But transboundary crisis is really because you can't reach into domains. You're really going to have to improvise in dealing with the effects of these crises. So these are some of the characteristics of the transboundary crisis that that we noted, and you can take that a level deeper, if you want to think about, how is that? Is it really a trend, for instance? Can we really talk about a trend, or is this just a discovery by academics? Oh, they suddenly discovered a transboundary dimension, and of course it's true. It's always been there. There's always been a transboundary dimension. But can we speak of a trend? Are we seeing more of it? Well, it's hard to say because who's counting? But you can make a theoretical argument that it almost seems logical to see more of them if you take Charles Perrow's normal accident thesis seriously, which in effect stated that if you build systems that are increasingly complex, meaning to say you really don't understand what you're running, think of the financial system, and then you couple these systems with other systems that you don't understand, you create perfect opportunities for small glitches to metastasize across these domains and literally fly under the radar of the people who think they're running these systems. And that was Charles Perrow. There's nothing, I'm just repeating what Charles Perrow was saying. That was back in 1984. And he was worried about that, and he said, and he repeated that when he rewrote, he reissued his book 15 years down the road, and he was really worried about the technological systems that we were building, and he said we were creating risks we don't understand, and this kind of chimed, of course, with Beck's risk society, Barry Turner's idea of industrial systems. And rephrasing it in transboundary terms, you could say, we're creating systems that give rise to incubation of all sorts of transboundary threats. And the simplest observation that goes from this, and we used to use it all the time 25 years ago, it's like, the more we fly and the shorter the times, and everybody's connected, you can fly from here to there, you could use it for terrorism. You could use it for pandemics. You open up the roads of modernity to these old-fashioned threats, and based on that kind of line of reasoning, you could argue that we're bound to see these transboundary crises. I don't know if that's true, because at the same time, we also probably build mechanisms to control of these. So that'll be a bit of an arms race, I suppose. But this little picture, and I don't know if you can read it, but it doesn't really matter. It just these are critical infrastructures, and this is a very old picture from 2001, and this came after 9/11, where suddenly everybody became worried about terrorists getting into our critical infrastructures and saying, look, if you hit one, they will have cascading effects on many other types of systems. So this has become, this was new in 2001. It really isn't new anymore. This is conventional wisdom, and it's just there's really an added dimension to it, if you will, because of the rise of cyber, which in 2001 we were not anywhere close to where we are now. Now we've come to a point where we voluntarily carry phones around and connect our our refrigerators and our cars to the internet, and who knows where that's going to end. Perot would be, he has passed, but I'm sure he would be aghast by all this. And we're not done, because we keep making things, shaping different types of challenges, making our threat environment more complex by all kinds of developments that I'm sure you recognize, and I'm sure you can think of any more. But that means the systems, not only are those systems that we're running, but also the government arrangements that we build to control these systems, whether that is in the domain of risk and regulation, or whether that is in the domain of crisis management, disaster management. We're really putting them to the test. So let's think about it now from a crisis management perspective, and think through if we create conditions for a different type of crisis, or see if this is really harder to manage, this type of crisis. And my argument will be that the challenges that, and any crisis is hard enough to manage. So these are added challenges. So if you build up on all the complexities and the urgency and the stress that any type of crisis causes, what makes a transboundary crisis even harder to handle? Well, first of all, I would say they're very hard to detect, and for the simple reason that they're originating in other domains. You have no idea which of those domains is going to be relevant for the one that you're running. Talking to policymakers now, so to speak, and you can't really expect policymakers to be monitoring any given system in the world and to see if let's say if a ship that runs aground in the Suez Channel, if it has any consequences for your supply chain, or whether COVID is going to have an emerging pandemic in China has any sort of consequences for you. In hindsight, it's all very clear. So that's never the problem. It's easy to puzzle back, and the forward thinking, and that's what detection is, of course, is to understand how a slight disturbance somewhere might have the potential to upset the system that you're in charge of. Now, the second point, when we talk about understanding crisis, the term in the literature that we're probably all familiar with is sense making, making sense of a crisis, which is essentially collecting, analyzing, sharing information. And that is usually the hardest part of a crisis, just to understand what kind of beast you're looking at. Now, if you have to get information from other domains that is formulated in a different type of language, not even a different language, but technical speak, for instance. So it's from another domain. So they have a different way of speaking and a different way of understanding things. It just becomes very hard at the apex of the system to put that all together and get a good grasp of the dynamic causes, dynamics, potential effects of a crisis. And think about COVID. We now all understand, for instance, what an R factor is, and because that's we've been trained to think that way. But very early on in the crisis, policymakers had to understand what R was. They had to understand what exponential growth is, and these two epidemiologists and specialists in that domain, that is just ABC 101 kind of stuff. But for policymakers, they really had to learn that. And one might argue, some people do argue, that they still don't understand what exponential growth is. And then the third point is, if you have different domains, and we just talked about that, and you have different responsibilities, by what mechanism do you arrive at a way of saying, okay, who's in charge here? And centralization in and of and by itself is not always the solution, as COVID has again demonstrated. You can centralize, say you're in charge, but then it turns out, in public-private domains, it doesn't always work that way. It's very hard to run hospitals from some administrative center, and it's certainly another debate that has really come to the surface is the debate, who is responsible? Are citizens responsible for their own health? And who is responsible for organizing vaccines, for instance? So this whole responsibility question can be is really interesting, especially for political scientists and sociologists, I imagine. So the conclusion of all of this almost has to be that the way we designed by happenstance or by blueprint thinking, whatever it was, our crisis management systems really are not going to help us much when we're hit by these type of crises. So that's, I mean, it's a pessimistic conclusion. So what would you need, and what will we need to fix this? And is it feasible? Obviously. So the 5 things that I think are urgent. I have no idea if it's ever going to work, but at least, you know, we're going to have to try, and academics can play a huge role here in thinking through why it wouldn't work and how it could work. So first of all, you know, sense making is something we spend a lot of time on it, but I'm still not sure if we've come to a methods that will help people understand complexity, deal with uncertainty, manage to qualify the level of uncertainty, and also help them to select what is relevant for their domain. So for instance, you know, what is strategic information and how does it differ from operational information? These are all questions that we run into all the time in practice. There's a lot of research emerging and you know, has existed for a long time. So it's not like nothing is happening, but we're still not there, and it's becoming more complex. The second challenge is, you know, how do we keep the decision makers in domains where there are given structures? How can we enhance coordination? And coordination, you know, it's both the problem and the solution, or the solution and the problem, however you want to call it, in crisis always. I dare you to find a report on a crisis that does not mention coordination, usually in a negative sense. And just a few simple, very, very simple observations based on COVID. You know, the whole travel mess we're in, you know, who gets to travel to which country, under which conditions right now. That's what we're talking about right now. Is quite amazing. And of course, the solution is not to say we'll have one person decide all this. The solution is to somehow create coordination. And the same with the vaccines or any type of resource needed. And in the early phases of the crisis, this was about masks, and this was about PPE, and it was about machines, personnel, and the timing of certain decisions. You know, if you close down certain things, how do you coordinate that with other systems that must do the same or suffer the consequences? So that's the second part. The second point. And the third one is communication. I think that's quite obvious because it kind of hangs with the second part. You know, it really doesn't help if policymaker in domain A has a totally different story than a policymaker in domain B or country B or domain B in country B. But you know, how to do that is not. There's no real easy solution there. Then the last 2 points are about learning, and again, we're in the middle of COVID, and there's a lot of learning going on by experts. But who's doing the learning on, for instance, the hot wash, as they call it in crisis management country? Who's doing the hot wash? You know, what works and what doesn't work, and how we're going to fix our shortcomings in our crisis management regime. You know, we did a lot of crisis management the last year. So can we say that Holland did it better than Sweden, or Sweden did Holland better? And how would we decide that? And there's, you all know how many papers are being published now on COVID. You can't even read all of them. So how do we get to a sort of a decisive, authoritative assessment of all that? Or do we have to wait 3 years? And we can't really wait for 3 years because the next variant is already on its way. So I think that is a huge challenge. And then you know, that slides into learning capacity in terms of how we're, and this is also the theme of this conference, how we're going to make structural reforms based on the experiences that we just went through. And so you know, how we're going to strengthen our institutions and strengthen the mechanisms to deal with these crises. That's of course a perennial question. There's nothing new about that question. There are constraints that typically also come with these crises, and on the one hand, standing arrangements, when do they work best? When we know the boundaries. When people know, I'm in charge of this domain, I'm a professional, I know the language, I understand where my professionalism ends, where it begins and where it ends, where somebody else's begins, and that really facilitates coordination. But the whole problem is those systems don't really work in a transboundary setting. So the whole idea of hierarchy that works so well slowly, there's a lot of overlap, this, that, the other, but it works. It does not work for transboundary crises. So I'm kind of intrigued by the U.S. effort to think about this around Hurricane Katrina, but after 9/11 and then up to Hurricane Katrina, so in the 2001, 2005, where they launched the concept of an incident of national significance, an INS, and really tried to think through what that will mean for government structures. And I'm not saying we should copy that, but I'm saying at least there is a beginning of a discussion. So the challenge, colleagues, is to create a transboundary crisis management capacity so that reaches across boundaries. And it's easy to state that, but it's hard to get it done. So there's our task, I think. And then I'll end with this slide and tying it back into legitimacy. These crises are significant tests for political leaders, policymakers, institutional leaders. Why? Because the mantra of our time is that integration is a solution for everything. If you don't follow the mantra, if you, like Hungary or the UK, if you claim that you don't want to be part of an integrated system, you want to get out of that system, then you know what the reaction is. And typically they'll tell you, you're going to suffer less trade. This is not good for you. This is so how do we then enable countries and sectors to be part of an integrated system if we don't design the capacity to deal with what the economists think call externalities, so the negative consequences of integration. And I think if we don't do that, or don't manage to do that, we're delegitimizing those efforts, those arrangements, and we're almost fueling the rise of people and organizations that will claim that it's better to operate outside of these systems. And so that's almost a call to arms for that we, and just underline the sense of urgency that comes with this topic. And I'll stop there, and thank you for listening.